Welcome to the Louchen Bros podcast. This show is hosted by Brian Louchen.
Oh yeah, and Kevin Louchen, brother.
Oh my god. And we're pros who talk about
nerd stuff. Alright, if that wasn't alluding to what we're going to be talking about, we got a very different one this time. We're going to be talking about the biopic, I guess, is what I'm going to call it. Hulk Hogan, Real American. One of the reasons why we decided to talk about this is Brian and I grew up really into wrestling. It was not just us. A lot of people kind of were, especially if you consider the 90s and 2000s. They're very, still relevant as far as that goes. It's very different now, but Hulk Hogan was, he was never, I didn't think, my favorite wrestler, but it's definitely something that he was very influential with a lot of what he did and basically really making, and I am confident in saying this, he really made wrestling into what it is now, because I don't think you get wrestling in the form it is now without him. That's how big of a deal to wrestling he was.
There would be no Suburban Commando without Hulk Hogan.
This is true. So what we'll do is we're just going to kind of follow through in the generalized timeline of how it was done and just talk about some of the points and give you some feedback and how it felt like with us, our personal experience, but it's very well just like what that can mean. So,
I think it was basically, like Kevin said, a biography of Hulk Hogan broken down into a mini-series into 4 parts. And I thought it was broken down very well. So
I did too. I
can't wait to kind of break it down and go through it.
So, I don't know if this is going to get a normal thumbs up or thumbs down at any point, but we'll have something at some point. So, basically in the early days, he was nothing special as a kid initially, but he did end up kind of developing, and it was a larger kid than most eventually. He always had this looking up to his brother aspect. His dad always seemed to be really proud of his brother, but not so much of him as far as that goes. I know this may sound weird, and maybe Brian will have a different experience, but I related on this. I don't know if it was verbatim said like this, but he said his dad never said "I love you." I know this sounds crazy, but I related so hard to this. Our dad has passed away since, and I know he loved me, but I don't know that I can ever recall a specific time that he said "I love you," and it was just in his DNA. Like, he didn't speak it, but I more than know I always felt it. How do you feel about that?
I feel the same way, Kev, and I feel like Dad probably was in the same position where do you see, or could you have felt Grandpa saying "I love you" to Dad?
Absolutely
either?
not.
So I think that was kind of passed down in that sense. However, on the flip side, I absolutely could have seen Grandma saying that all the fucking time. You know what I mean?
For sure. I mean, obviously, nobody knows who we're talking about in a sense, but maybe of experiences. I mean, I don't know that Grandpa's relationship with our dad was great. You know what I mean? You hear stories of back in the day, as they say, and it was a different time period. But now, me being a father, it is one of those things I do make sure I try to say that, but just as important as our father did, I want to show him too, I want to make sure that, it's one thing to say it, but it's another to actually mean it and to show it. So it is something I find a lot of value in. So ironically, something I think that was supposed to be so subtle in the show was so, resonated so heavily with me, because I'm like, holy shit, I know that feeling.
Yeah, just to kind of describe the breakdown or the title of each episode, which I think kind of displays it very well, is
okay.
The first episode name was The Rise.
Yes.
So we're kind of talking about the growing up, the childhood of, and I think even it showed his older brother was like praised a lot by his parents, or especially his dad, and he was kind of the
just the afterthought. Yeah,
he did
like,
not get any praise.
Yeah, and if you've ever seen anything about Hogan, more often than not, you saw the personality of the character. You didn't actually see Hogan. And at this age, there was no Hogan. This was just a kid that was very large, and both, probably more ways than one, that he, height, weight, everything. He just was very large. He said he played baseball, which led into bowling, which this element, then to being a bassist. I was like, what the fudge? I was like, he was a bassist in a band before he even did wrestling. And it ended up playing a little bit of a role in the show. And I'm like, I could never imagine him playing music like that. But I love that he did. So it just makes when he does Hollywood Hogan later in life, it's like, oh yeah, he really could have, like, that was a real thing for him. So I found that very interesting to learn.
I thought it was really cool of one of the lines in the series. They basically talked about how the gym was his sanctuary. And later in the series, I think it's in part 4, or even throughout, actually, it shows as Hogan's talking, he's actually working out with his son, which I thought was a really cool aspect.
Yeah, the current time of the recording, as they go to the, he's telling a story, it's usually him and his son. And I think we'll get into that towards the end. I want to cover, like, what the actual portrayal of this meant, because I think this was done in a way intentionally. So I want to cover that later. But
sure.
So the next part is then he, like, as I said, he eventually, decides not to go to college. He becomes in a band. He was frowned upon by his father for not going to college, and he starts traveling. But he'd already started finding desire and love for wrestling, watching Dusty Rhodes and whatnot. And what happened is at those events, he was actually being recruited by, I do believe, Steve Blair, and as even Hogan's words, groomed to get into wrestling, because what he found out is it's basically an act. Like these guys were not the people they were in the ring, and he learned that, and he's like, oh, like, I can become this vision. He thought that was the person, and I think that realization led to the early days of him getting into wrestling. And so Brian and I actually do have some wrestling experience, and I'm not talking about your high school wrestling, man. We did amateur wrestling, Brian a lot more than me, but we did do a version of this. And so this is once again why I said this stuff really hits home to us in a little bit of a different way when he starts talking about the early days, about gimmick and character and personality and wrestling moves and long-term effects of health, and is wrestling real or not. That stuff is really something we know a lot about, because there are a lot of elements really to that. And we didn't get any major, but we do know some people that did get big time. We locally used to watch CM Punk wrestle before he was even close to the WWE. So it's like, it goes back a long, long time for us as far as that goes. So, but
shout out LWF.
Yeah, LWF. If anybody's checking us out, we remember it was good times there for sure.
Have you read the book by CM Venom, actually, Kev?
No, I have
about
not.
LWF? It's actually really phenomenal.
Okay, I might have to get into that.
So Thunderpants actually has a copy of it.
Yes, Thunderpants. Going back in the day for sure. But basically, like a lot of people, the vision, I think, that they saw for Hogan because of his size, even they said when he was playing bass, he stuck out like a sore thumb, and you went to him because, he's 6'7" or some shit. Yeah. He's huge. So playing the bass on stage, he's easily towering, most people, probably by almost a foot, or at least a half a foot. And so he started as a tag team wrestler at the Dungeon. And but then his first character was Super Destroyer, and because they didn't want him getting known to crowds as sort of a loser, a jobber, as they might say, he was masked. And they do things even now still with this stuff intentionally, because once what, and he alludes, and I love this, and I did note a couple times. you can do all you want as a wrestler with your gimmick and character. And at some point, you don't have full control. Fans dictate things. It is just the way it works. And he literally mentions it a couple times through there where you don't exactly have the steering wheel as much as you think you do. And so if you get your name out there in one regard, or you're trying to, and fans are like, yeah, no, they don't like it, they're going to let you know it. And that's the best thing as a fan perspective of wrestling, where I don't want to say you have control, but your opinion in a sense is immediately felt and heard. They can hear the crickets, they can hear the cheers, and they can hear the boos. And each of those played a decision role in what they're gonna do with decision making, and it showed. Like, people could tell there's a vibe, there's a feeling. It's a weird sort of animal that has a life and breath, and as much as Vince McMahon at the time pulled a lot of strings, eventually he isn't trying to make the decision, the fans are. Did you get that? Tell me your experience with that, because that's how I've seen and felt things.
Yeah, the biggest thing in wrestling is telling a story that connects with the audience. That is the biggest thing. I mean, most recently, John Cena retired, and he was getting reactions from both sides of it. John Cena sucks, and John Cena getting cheered, and you just want to get a reaction from the crowd. That is the biggest thing, because you want them to care, positively or negatively.
And that's where you don't always have the control. Sometimes you aim for something with the decision or whatever, but there are definitely points where Hogan even stated he did not expect that, and we'll cover that a little bit more down the road. But
definitely.
So that's why I said at first he started as mask, but then as you're a little green, you get better wrestling technique. You develop.
Green? What's green, Cub?
You're just a little raw, so to say. And he develops and get better, and he then ends up going, his first character unmasked is Terry Boulder. All right, so it's not Hulk Hogan like we know him. That's how he starts, as Terry Boulder. He talks with a southern accent and all this other jazz, and he's kind of quiet and dry, and people don't realize it's not still the Hogan that you've learned and known. Eventually, his transition goes then to Terry the Hulk Boulder. This is a direct reference at the time period to the Incredible Hulk. It was on the TV, and it was a reference to that. So that's literally a direct connection, as he was considered almost as big as the Hulk. And Lou Ferrigno, he's a massive man, and was able to do that, and it's just telling of the time and period that even that was an abnormally large human.
I had a quote here, which is funny because Bret Hart actually shows up in here, and Bret Hart was basically talking mad shit, as he always does, about Hogan, and he said all he knew was a bear hug, because that was his finisher.
Yeah, I mean,
that he would use, and it's oh my.
And it was, but once again, early on, bear hug wasn't difficult, but the reason why it was used is because he was a large human, and it definitely showed his enormous size and strength, and it was believable because he's taking large men themselves and still doing that to them. So that's why he was an anomaly. That's why he got a huge push in wrestling, and it was just more about developing the character and the skill. And then that eventually, from Terry the Hulk Boulder, that's when he will eventually go to his mostly beginnings, the Incredible Hulk Hogan, as far as that goes. I mean, that's a little bit more down the line, but yeah, it's very interesting to see, because there are times where people can go through numerous amount of characters and personalities, but yet over time, you're lucky to get one that really sticks and becomes what they are. And even then, it can have some changes and adaptations over time, but it's not easy to get a character win over, and he was able to do that. And I don't know that it was the character was so great. It was, I think, a byproduct of the time period for sure, if you consider what was happening in America, but also the fact that he was almost like an untapped potential as far as his physique and size and all that.
Yeah, and as you said, Kevin, trying to find your gimmick, your character that resonates with the audience, even if you do find your gimmick, and this is something I'll allude to with the later third part of the miniseries, is Chris Jericho does this very well. You have to reinvent yourself as well too, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But yeah, I also liked the rock song and kind of the music that they actually use in this beginning episode, as far as kind of with the storytelling, I thought was really good too.
Yeah, they are just at this point, I think, trying to show his development as a wrestler, as well as going through the wave, the roller coaster of what it's like to build a persona outside of the or inside of the ring, and how you get early stages of that has direct and indirect correlations to you outside of the ring, and it just even amplifies as these parts go on. So but the history of it's not just Hogan, and that's what I mean is he was so big for wrestling, because at that time you're talking about, it wasn't just WWF, or wrestling was divided in the country by wrestling territories.
The territory days.
Yeah, like that is like a thing, and it really was. And like these companies almost ran areas, and it was not unified, and that's why it was very different. So you could be in one part of the states and nobody has any idea who you are in other parts. It was actually quite normal, but it ended up being that I do believe Jimmy Hart recruited Hogan when he was Terry Boulder, and this is where he then gets the Terry the Hulk reference. And he ends up wrestling Jerry Lawler, and Jerry Lawler, he's one of the all-time greats for sure. And he was doing so much for wrestling, but once again, he still couldn't have done it by himself, because as great as Jerry Lawler was, nobody had the size Hogan did. And I think that really is what stood out. And that eventually started leading. Hogan got the call from Vince McMahon Sr. to come to New York, because once they found out about him, that was the key. They wanted to push this giant man to be a name, to get out there, to hopefully become more prominent in the world. And obviously, on a business side, that means more money. So that's why you do things for that reason, as far as that goes.
I just wanted to jump back real quick.
Yeah, for sure.
About the territory days. So this was a fascinating time in the pro wrestling history, because you had Jim Crockett at the Mid-Atlantic area, which was like the Carolinas and Virginia. You had wrestling in Florida. You had Memphis wrestling covering Tennessee and Kentucky. You had Mid-South in Louisiana, Oklahoma, and Arkansas. You had WCCW based in Texas, world-class championship wrestling with the Von Erich family. You had AWA in kind of the Midwest and Great Plains area. You had Stampede Wrestling from basically Canada, which you had the dungeon where Bret Hart and the Hart family came from. You had the WWF, the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, who was owned by the McMahon family, Vince McMahon Sr., and then you also had Western State Sports, was West Texas and New Mexico and Amarillo. So you had all these different wrestling territories, and the fascinating thing is, as Kevin said, you might go for a period of time in one territory to kind of see how that goes, and then go to a completely other territory to see if that actually works or not. So it was a good way to kind of test the waters and experiment and try different things to see what actually gets over with the crowd. And I just thought it was a very fascinating thing before things kind of changed later on from the territory.
For sure. So as I mentioned, he got notoriety. Then Vince McMahon Sr. Recruited him to New York because he wanted to make this big name character. At the time, he ended up, he was supposed, and this is what I was mentioning, he was supposed to come in, face against a heel Ted DiBiase, and become a face. However, when he is going through, it's like he is brutalizing him, and New York ended up actually booing him and making him a heel. That screws your plans up immediately if you're a promoter and what you're trying to do and angles and matchups, and it's like that happens, and it's not, you can't control that. You can't keep trying to make him a face. You want to run with what a decision is
What's
made.
a face, Kev?
Face is a good guy, a heel is a bad guy. So, yeah, I'm talking in wrestling terms. I kind of expecting people to know, so my apologies. But the idea is this heel is there. And, yeah, you could eventually attempt to make him a face, but you want to kind of ride the wave, right? You want to, if that motion's in place, you kind of got to do it. So he gets this, he gets over on the crowd in that regard. But, however, because he's his size and, it's not like wrestling is in a bubble, that in mainstream media, he gets out as being this huge guy. He's seen, and he's actually recruited for Rocky 3. That's the movie Rocky 3. So he goes in and he's that heel that got that notoriety there. And he's not Hogan, but he's the person, and he kind of carries over a heel mentality, and it goes over great because, at least in the part of the world, he's already that, in the U.S. And it's like, it's easy to kind of just keep manipulating the crowd in that regard. It didn't stop. His character kind of, at least in a form, still keeps going. And that's what you have to do as a wrestler. It's not just a wrestler. You're an entertainer. That is literally part of the huge part of the element.
Wasn't during that part, too, Kev, they were describing in the miniseries that, didn't he get an ultimatum from Vince McMahon Sr. if he was going to do the movie? I remember that.
So yeah, when he told Vince McMahon Sr., he's like, hey, I got this huge opportunity, blah, blah, blah. And Vince McMahon Sr., you go do that, because he had something else lined up for you. You're done in New York. And he said, all right. So he went and did a movie.
Yeah, and he got his name over even big time.
Yeah, and once
big
again,
time.
He was known now, not just in New York or in, the South where he started. He's now, intercontinentally known in all these territories, even if he hasn't quite wrestled yet, because that is not the current social media time we live in. It was a lot smaller as far as how word would get around back then if it wasn't on, main cable and whatnot. But when he did go to do a movie, that's when he met his first wife, Linda. Now, as much as that doesn't affect him wrestling, it was a huge element to him in his life, and eventually a lot of later years a downfall is into turmoil as far as that goes. So it's still a huge element. He was very much in love with her, and I think, I don't know, the vibe you get is, at least from this biopic, towards the end, I don't think he ever stopped loving her. Things just didn't work out for him as far as that goes, and I think she felt the same way. Like they almost regret not doing things differently, but it is what it is. He said he couldn't go back. So after the movie, what he decided to do is, if it wasn't New York, the other big place was Minnesota. Minnesota was one of the biggest wrestling territories as far as that goes. And if anybody's familiar, especially with old wrestling, that's where you get Jesse the Body Ventura. He was one of my favorite wrestlers simply for the fact that he was in the movie Predator, and I'm not even unbiased about it. I am completely biased and totally enamored that he was one of my favorites just because he was in one of my favorite movies. But he obviously even became governor of Minnesota, I think is his position. So he had a huge following in that area and was a huge notoriety. But at that point, once he came in to face him, even though he was more deemed a heel at the time, once again, the crowd changed him and started cheering him and moved him to being a face. And those are the early stages of him starting to realize the adaptation of the American persona.
Which then goes into the second episode.
Yeah. And then at the last part, they just mentioned that Vince McMahon Jr. gives him a call and say, hey, baby, New York wants you back. You know what I mean? But yeah, so that would be the end of the first one. So you really get the the slow crawl and climb up to, you know, you really haven't even got into the Hulk Hogan at all yet. This is just how the wrestling world worked back then, and you see the early stages of him essentially becoming the uniting force of what wrestling is today. As a almost, if you think about it in professional sports, you have, you know, the pros, and then, you know, college levels or minor leagues, and then, you know, everything below that. And that's what I feel like wrestling is now. It's got those leagues and hierarchies, but back then it was not like that, as far as that goes.
Yeah, and like Kevin kind of talked about, eventually Vince Jr., when he came over back to WWF, he didn't have a persona, so that's when, again, he kind of dropped the moniker as far as that and became basically where he changed his name to Hulk Hogan. And that's when he's decided, when he was starting to build momentum, he needed to have a gimmick, right, Kev?
Yeah.
And that's when he went with patriotism and pro-America.
Yeah, so as he does move, one of the big things is he ends up marrying Linda, which they go into more about that. And this early stages where they just show, and this, if you look at why they did this biopic, there's not necessarily a reason they wanted to highlight Hogan as a light, but when you tell some sort of biography of somebody, you are still, whether you like it or not, you know, you're not completely objective. There is a subjectivity to it, and I think this is a means that they, towards the end of Hogan's life, he had a little bit more negativity than he had positivity. And no matter what he did, I think he always wanted to be a good guy in his life and viewed that way. And I think something like this, showing how much of a family man he was, how much he, eventually loved being a dad, how much he really cared for Linda, I think he's trying to display, or whoever the editors and producers are trying to display Hogan in a manner that he's a good American. Obviously, he makes mistakes and screws up, but I think they really are wanting to paint him as that wasn't how he, screwing up wasn't in his nature. It wasn't what he was trying to do. He was an all-American boy, and it was reflective in his character, essentially, too, and eventually.
That's a very good point. I didn't actually think about it like that, but you're absolutely right, Kev, because they did want to show those different aspects of his life, not just the character Hulk Hogan, but the man Terry Bollea.
Yes. And he even describes of how much it's almost hard to separate it at certain times, and it really is, especially because he lived it as long as he did and was almost constantly performing and entertaining. So
I imagine it's like that for a lot of celebrities like Eminem and Marshall Mathers. Like, where do you draw the line between that, because that's an entertainer, right?
Yeah. No matter what profession you are in, if you're a sculptor, a painter, a movie actress or actor, a musician, a sports athlete, there's a version the public sees, and then there's the real sort of person they are behind closed doors, or just not even behind closed doors, just not in the public light, right? Like most people are the version behind closed doors, and then the local person that people see. But when you get that famous, there's a public light. There's a third element that I think what everybody thinks they know as a person. So I think just the regular person is not focused on enough. But to be fair, and I believe this, it's his own doing. He didn't make enough effort to make it separate. He was being Hulk Hogan almost all the time, and so he blurred the lines. I don't think it was blurred by people. He did it, so I don't think that should ever be misinterpreted. It wasn't other people's doing it; was his doing that. He always thought he was the American, the good old American boy, and as far as that goes.
Well, you're a pain in my ass, Kevin, in the public eye or behind closed.
I mean, you're welcome, motherfuckers. Rolling along here. So with that idea, that's really when to get the push as the persona as he's kind of feeling and developing. That's when it was easy to do because they get the Iron Sheik. Iron Sheik is he was supposed to become the champ from him. This is when you're talking about conflicts in the Middle East. You're talking about communism still. This is still the 80s. Even if, the Cold War is, I don't think it's done, but it's like mostly towards the end. It's like there's still so much relevance there. And that's why I said it was tied to society at the time as far as is helping build this all-American feel. And so in the process of winning it, his dad ends up showing up and being there for that match. And it's where he finds, his dad says he's proud of him after basically being looked down by his dad because not going to college and always feeling like the second son. He gets this huge approval from probably one of the people that I don't think was shown so much in there, but I would guarantee you, he said it meant a lot to him. I think it meant way more than what was depicted in the show because one would argue that he was doing it almost uniformly in a way to get hopefully approval from, I'm sure his mother was fine, but getting his dad's approval would have been so important to him. That's just me guessing. I just feel like it was bigger than what it was even portrayed in the movie.
No, I agree. Like if you're trying to get the attention of your mentor or your parents and you're disappointing them or not feeling like you're good enough, you're going to be so elated if you finally are getting that recognition to some degree of being a failure or whatever and finally meeting that and getting them to the top of the mountain essentially. So I 100% agree.
So that led into what is probably the biggest ordeal in wrestling history, despite everything that's happened, and I stand by this. WrestleMania 1. And it might not have been the most entertaining WrestleMania. It might not have been the best, but it was the biggest ordeal is because it led to what we have today. It's a unified, almost wrestling element. It's a hierarchy of element. It brought, essentially, I don't want to say it eliminated the territories, but in a sense, it basically did.
It absolutely kind of killed the territories because Vince McMahon Jr. essentially was grabbing talent from all the areas. And again, now he's trying to take all these separated factions, essentially, of wrestling pockets around the country to now, okay, I'm going to try to make this a phenomenon in the States and eventually go global.
And it worked. It worked. And I mean, obviously, there's still small independents. There's some big independent feds that are going on and going. But in reality, it unified wrestling for the fans, the masses, and even for some of the wrestlers to get some attention and focus on them and notoriety. So it wasn't like it wasn't without cost. They were saying like basically he had everything riding on this. So if it would have failed, McMahon would have went under. That's a definitive state, and I believe that. But because of that, it basically Hogan's the centerpiece, and he was a huge event. It was gaining interest from everybody within all factions of life, and it literally is why we have wrestling the way we have it today. I 1,000% believe that. And that's why I will say Hogan himself is the biggest thing that's ever happened to wrestling. You couldn't change my mind.
I 100% agree. And I think one of the things differently that Hogan did than a lot of other wrestlers didn't do is he was basically a business. He was a role model. I mean, he's the first one who basically had merchandising. He was marketing professional wrestling. He was a businessman outside of a normal wrestler, and other workers and wrestlers weren't doing that. I mean, and he was learning and talking and merchandise and licensing and talking the language from different females, and they kind of show that. So that was tying it in, and that's why they kind of put the rocket ship on his ass, is because he's pushing this farther than a lot of other guys. And so when you start adding the marketing and him getting into the other movies, regardless of how good they were or not, again, that's going to make the company soar even more.
So that is a huge thing. I don't think it's at that stage yet for sure, but I think it's starting to develop. He's starting to notice it. I think one of the things that's kind of done slightly out of order is they start talking about the lawsuit that he ends up getting, but it actually happened 5 days before WrestleMania. And he was recruited to be on a show. They were doing so much advertising, and he was getting drained. And he was lied to in this recruitment to do it for some kids. And he goes on this show with Richard Belzer. If you're not familiar, I didn't know who the name was, but I saw it, and I'm like, I know that guy. He was on SVU, if you're a guy. He was one of the cops. And I was like, okay, he's kind of familiar. But when I saw him, like the interaction that was on the show with Hogan and Mr. T and Belzer, I'm like, oh my God, this guy's a piece of shit. I thought he was a piece of shit on the show, how he was mocking him and making a joke about it. And you could see why Hogan was upset with it. He was even being egged on by Mr. T, like, yeah, just kill him a little longer. And I don't know that he, as he even said, this is a biopic produced by his people. They clearly did it in a way that they can't ignore what happened, because it did happen. But it was at least a way of making sure it was heard from his perspective. And in reality is, if he was lured there in false pretense, that's a shitty thing to do. Not unsurprising in Hollywood, surprise. But at the same time, I don't know that he really did mean to do it, because it's not like he cranked back. It looked like he just tightened it. You know, like his actions didn't seem like it. He looked surprised, like he's like, oh, you like whatever. But like as he said, he's like, he did not feel bad in the slightest, because this guy was being a piece of shit and asshole to him. So I was kind of, whether you like him or not, I was in his corner in this scenario, because that guy was being a dip. All the other words I will stop saying, because all I'm doing is swearing about how I think the guy was. And I loved him on SVU, but man, was this show, he was not, it was not okay in my book. But I mean, I have an affinity for wrestling, so.
Yeah, I mean, even the clip they showed on the miniseries, Belzer was such a dick to Hogan. He's lucky he got as less as he actually did, because Hogan could have did a lot worse to him with his size and them going to court and everything like that. But yeah, I did not care for that whole scenario, him being invited there at all.
Yeah, and he was so worried about it and everything, which eventually, once he gets the cash or the check from WrestleMania, he's like, oh, fuck yeah! Like, he starts getting real money.
And they were very worried that, because it took a big chunk out of Hogan and McMahon with that lawsuit.
It was like $1 million. And that was back then, so it was probably seemingly even more. So, but fortunately, they didn't see a big thing with it. They got past it because they got paid. It led into, I don't know. They talked about this, but eventually it led into the event with Hogan's brother, Alan O'Dean. He came over and was there, but I don't know. I don't know how big of an ordeal was to it. They made it sound like it, but I don't know that they really talked about it much. So, but I know he didn't want to talk about it on camera. So maybe that's why they kind of glossed over it a little bit. But it's like, I don't know. Everything that happened after that, he didn't seem to be dramatically affected. So it might have bothered him a lot, but it didn't seem to affect it. He just kind of kept going. At least maybe that was just one of the bad things that boiled up that led over to the eventual spillover of him. I don't know, but
yeah, I don't think we got the full story. Yeah, because it definitely seemed to me like it affected him, but it kind of Hogan seemed like he didn't want to talk about it, and there was a lot of missing part of that. So I'm curious to see.
Maybe it's like one of those things where like. That's when the early stages of he's disconnecting to his family. He's drinking and partying more, just drowning his feelings. That could be what that is. Yep. But either way, they didn't get into it, and but that eventually carried over to Hogan as a charity element and working with Make-A-Wish. Say what you want. The guy did a crap ton for charity. I know he did some very bad things in his life, but he also did some amazing things, and that is sometimes hard for people to balance when sometimes a person can do bad things and good things. I think overall, yeah, he said some terrible things later on in his life, and his actions didn't marry up with some of his good intents, but he was really good for kids. The 80s and 90s, I really truly believe that. I think he really gave a lot to a lot of kids, and that's something I think is really hard to replace no matter who you are.
Yeah, I mean, he was a shining light for a lot of people, right? Like, again, you show him in the miniseries as far as him going to the hospitals and, like, they want a reason to fight to live, right? So he was a perfect person to be that superhero for them. And I think that he was very sincere in a lot of
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? I really do.
And I think this is just starting to build that business element that he hasn't quite done yet, but you could see he is a product, and it's slowly happening. How are you this? At first it was just one kid, he said, and then it was two kids, and then it's a group of kids, and just kept building. You're seeing him understand this. And that led into WrestleMania 2 with this fight with Andre the Giant, which might be arguably, in my opinion, way better than WrestleMania 1 was. That his fight with Andre the Giant was probably one of his best. As far as, at the time, he is a phenom of just wrestling lore.
WrestleMania 3, not 2.
Oh, I thought they said 2. I don't know my history that well. I didn't really watch it. I did watch that match, but yeah, thank you for correcting me. But apparently the WrestleMania 2 or 3 with Andre the Giant, with him suplexing him, I remember how big, like, that was the only other thing that was top tier talked about was like his suplexing. Was it? Oh, I don't think he was the only one, if I recall.
It was not
with Yokozuna.
Yeah, but Kevin, WrestleMania 2 was the Hogan King Kong Bundy steel cage match.
Oh, okay.
And that was iconic. The blue old school cage.
Was that the first cage match or no?
I don't know if it was the first cage match.
Well, that was the first maybe WWF notarized cage match. I'm sure they probably did stuff like that before then. But yeah, I mean, my time's off a little bit, but Andre the Giant Hogan match is, whether you know the exact time or date or not, it was a big ordeal. And his relationship with him, what Andre was to the wrestling business, what he was as a person, he was also a great dude. But it ended up, all of this started leading into the eventual, as you mentioned, businessman that Hulk Hogan becomes.
Yeah, and the Hulk Andre match was like David versus Goliath.
Yes.
And like
for two big dudes.
And this was also iconic because this was a passing of the torch, really, because Andre was so well regarded in the wrestling business. And so this was passing of the torch, and like him couldn't be body slammed and stuff like that. And then when that happened, even to this day, rewatching it still holds up because of how iconic
you could feel it.
History that was.
You could feel it. Like that's what I'm saying. Like fans, they're cheering, they're booing. The feelings are coming through, and you feel that happen when he gets it done. You feel the cheering. Like it's like any sort of playoff sports. You can feel the energy. That is not a regular season game. This WrestleMania was not a regular, Monday night show or something like that. It was, you could feel it. And that I don't know if that directly did or not, but at some point that led into this, okay, I know this is a thing. He's become a brand. And whether you like him or not, they did bring him in. Not surprising to me. But that's early years of when he meets Donald Trump, the businessman, not the president, and they start. I think I don't know that Trump did much for him then, but I imagine they had a lot of business conversations behind the scene, and I think that I truly believe it's mentioned here once again intentionally to get the sense of of his learning and adapting to understanding, that's when you start getting the marketing. That's when you start becoming a brand. I mean, do you see it differently? It's like, yeah, we know that's when stuff happened, but I think they're portraying it as Trump had a way of maybe influencing the final push to get him to start becoming a brand like that.
No, I 100% agree, and like I said, he was becoming a business and a role model and that sort of thing, and learning from Trump and being involved with that, and then again, later on, the pay-per-view and the presidential election. So that was definitely foreshadowing 100%.
Yeah, I don't think Trump himself did anything for Hogan. I think it was just the conversations that built the ideas and the concepts. I didn't get the impression he didn't do anything. He just maybe was friends with him and they talked. I think all the business was on Hogan's end and the WWF's end as far as that goes.
Oh, I agree.
But at this time, once you become what you're becoming, an icon in wrestling, a brand, this is the same time, which is huge, where you then has his two kids. You have first Brooke Hogan and then Nick Hogan. This then foreshadows him becoming that family man, that loving being a father, that happy to see them. But then the more and more leaving, you get more and more sad, and it's harder to leave your kids, and especially he'd be gone for like a week at a time, sometimes longer, and it ended up bringing up thoughts of retiring. And, this, I can imagine he was, maybe in his, back then, 30s or something, or right around that age. And it's crazy to think about retiring at that age for a lot of people. But at the same time, he started making enough money because of being the brand and all that. And it was really, this is where the WWF gets in a position where, okay, if he is going to call it quits, who we giving it to? Like his fame, his spot, so to say, on the roster has to be taken up. And if you're going to pass it to anyone, the thought was, give it to the Ultimate Warrior. And the Ultimate Warrior, in a sense, you might say, was all bark and no bites, unfortunately. And I remember the Warrior like this. This is about the time period when I start remembering wrestling, because I didn't remember some of this is all before my time. So I don't think we might not have got into wrestling until almost the 90s.
Yeah, and then we got a lot of the VHS tapes.
Yes,
and stuff like
so that's how we did watch some of the stuff. That's VHS dating right here, right? But
what's a VHS tape?
Yeah, but it just showed like you have to pass the torch, as it said. So the thought was Ultimate Warrior, but a lot of people were even worried back then because they did not think he had what it takes to cut the mustard. So in the process of trying to transition, and he's kind of doing his retirement journey, it was noted that it was not going well. They showed promos to do that. Now, I think I recall it not going well in my perspective, but once again, were they intentionally showing some of these interviews of the Warrior to make him look kind of bad, to show that it wasn't doing it? Yeah, maybe, but it actually wasn't going good. They didn't make that up. It did not transition well, and part of it was his character. He just didn't have a great character. It was mostly about physique and pizzazz and energy. He was high energy, whatever, but he didn't have like the real grit of what wrestling was meant to represent. And
it was more than just a persona, though. With
yes,
the Warrior. He could not wrestle for a lick. He didn't have the marketing and business savvy like Hogan did to lift everybody else up. And so, the transition to the Warrior was a bomb.
And so they allude to it eventually transitioning to Sergeant Slaughter, which then basically recreates the whole dynamic that was the Iron Sheik, which then leads it back to Hogan not really retiring. So this is about where the first or the second part ends, and we start getting into the third one. But I don't know if it's a sense of they were trying to make it look like, oh, they pulled Hogan back or something like that. I mean, no matter what, I don't care what anybody says, Hogan never wanted to leave. He never wanted to leave. He wanted to leave, but the minute somebody like this gets out of the limelight, he wants to be right back in. And that's all that I was seeing, no matter what you, like, oh, I'm a family man. Yeah. Unfortunately, and I will say this, I think Hogan was selfish. And he wanted his family, but at the same time, he didn't want to stop getting that high from wrestling. And that was the selfish aspect. He was an addict. And I think I thought I remember somebody saying a form of that at one point, but he was addicted to the crowd, to the hype, whether it was the boos or the cheers, mostly the cheers. But yeah, he was an addict. And I think you get to that level and you want that and you crave that. I think that's, unfortunately, that might be a normal thing. And I don't think even at the end, towards the end there, I don't think he ever lost his ego. I think he had it fully intact his whole time, if you ask me. But him basically saying, "Oh, I was trying to retire," blah blah blah. I'm like, you were trying to retire. I don't think you ever felt good about it, or were ever gonna. Even if you retired, I don't see him being gone longer than 2 years. He would have been back.
Even when he was trying to retire, they showed the clips when he was on Thunder in Paradise and was just like out of control and miserable and didn't want to be there. You know, even with his ego and stuff like that. But he even said at one point, they were, I forget who said it. Maybe it was Bischoff or somebody else, but they said, talk about the Roaring 20s. World War I and II, the Wild Wild West, and then there's the Hulkamania era. So I was definitely a Hulkamaniac.
Oh, for sure.
For sure. So.
I mean, his era was probably a decade plus of that character, for sure. The early days to that. And even though it hit his, past his prime, it was still a thing even in the 90s. I remember that for sure.
Oh, it launched wrestling into mainstream. I mean, and that's why he's got to be on basically the, he's one of the top 4. He's got to be, just because of what
he has to be. Like I said, he may not be your favorite wrestler. He's not my favorite wrestler, but he is as far as I'm concerned, he's the Tom Brady, the Michael Jordan of his sport, period. There's nobody else. And it's not because of his, quote, accomplishments. It's what he did for the sport itself. He wasn't like Ric Flair was the number of champions and stuff like that, like 16 or I don't remember.
I mean, you weren't looking at Hogan for the iconic matches like Savage Steamboat and shit like that. You know what I mean? Or Flair Steamboat. You're looking at it because you wanted to be part of the show. You wanted to be entertained, and Hogan was going to give that to you. Not to mention every freaking card or pay-per-view he was on, you were going to get a bigger payday than you were.
And they said
about that.
And I, even as a teenager, and even though I was over Hulk and Hulkamania, though, it was something like, you see him do that, he gets up and he's shaking his head and he's like, no, and he's, even if he's bloody or not, and he's getting that way, like it was a thing. You got over it because you've seen it so many times, but still, it was like, it still had its in the feels kind of moment all the time. So I don't. As much as he wants to act like he wanted to leave, I never thought he wanted to leave. He wanted to be with his kids more, but I don't think he ever really wanted to leave wrestling.
That's true, but that's when times are starting to change, because even when he did start coming back after the Slaughter thing, people were starting to kind of get over that, and that's when they went to Yokozuna, and then they went to kind of Bret Hart, right? And the excellence of execution, and and Hulk wasn't very happy with Bret.
So before we get to that, a little bit leads up. I want to mention is when he does come back, he talks about his demandments, which I thought was really interesting. He's like, you train, you eat your vitamins, and you do your prayers and whatnot. The problem is, right before right in the process of the comeback, he got caught up in the steroid era, and then he lied about it, and it ended up. That's what ended up paving the way towards the crowds kind of moving on to him, getting to Bret Hart. Is he now has blemishes, and he's not the all-American boy that he was always portrayed as, because now he has that. Now, to be fair, figuratively, maybe literally, everybody was doing steroids. It was not like an uncommon thing. It was like a supplement that wasn't necessarily deemed as a bad thing, and then it did become known as a bad thing, and that's kind of what happened. That's my understanding of it, but I'm basing off of a vague idea of what I remember history being, so I could totally be wrong. This is fun, huh?
Yeah, I mean, that was, you don't know who, there was probably more people doing steroids than not doing steroids in that era, just because of the, the metabolic rates and how the performance.
Needing to look huge. Like, you didn't have to have the strength per se. Obviously, that would help. And you just wanted to look huge. Hogan might be the reason for that.
And then
even,
also
you know
the
what I mean?
recovery, too.
Yeah, of course. That's helpful. But, I mean, they were also doing hard drugs. I'm sure they weren't really covering that a whole lot. You know what I mean? Like, oh, yeah, all the cocaine he was doing, and they basically alluded a little bit. How else are you going to go on no sleep for, 6 days in a fucking row?
Oh, my God. Speaking of cocaine, have you seen the meme videos of cocaine online?
No.
It's like a meme of Kane, but they're like, oh God, it's cocaine! And
yes.
Like,
He's always got the white powder, so everyone acts like he's getting somebody high. Yeah, he's a little ridiculous. I love the amount of ways they've kind of used Kane and just, showed it in a different form. There's like a gay flamboyant version I remember seeing too. I don't remember.
All right, let's get back to Hogan. Sorry.
Anyways, yeah. So when he does actually try to make the comeback, Bret Hart's got the belt, but he's trying to come back with Beefcake, and what happens is because he is who he is to McMahon, he's got his ear, and this is the stuff that I don't like in this world. But it is how it works. So if you're going to ignore it and act like it doesn't happen, then you're only lying to yourself. He had Vince McMahon's ear. He put the little birdie, as they say, in his ear, and he ended up pulling the strings to eventually make Bret Hart lose the belt to Yoko, which then he got it. The problem is, in this interview, I think he made himself look very shitty, because he's like, Vince McMahon made a decision, and what do I have to do with that? And at the same time, he knows, and it was alluded to how much he fucking finagled that to happen. And Bret Hart has been my favorite wrestler, like, forever. And I love him. But boy, oh boy, he definitely is bitter. And he comes off even worse anytime he talks. If you watch basketball, he's like Scottie Pippen with Michael Jordan. Like, it is terrible. Yeah. And I love Bret Hart. I thought he was an amazing wrestler, and he did get plenty of raw deals in his time. But you can't make up for it, unfortunately, at this point. It's not like people are just going to make things differently. But, I mean, I'm at least glad he voiced his opinion. He said, like, when he was talking about, he's like, oh, yeah, thanks for winning my belt back for you. Like, talking about taking it away from Yokozuna. And he's like, it's such a Hulk thing to do. And to be honest with you, it felt like very Hulk thing to do. So to act like that was so just Vince McMahon's idea to give it to Hogan, I think was very shitty of him, and I absolutely believe that he did a number on Bret Hart, and it's kind of despicable.
Facts.
And it's not the first time or the last time that he will do something. I believe he probably has done this, but once again, this whole thing is done and produced in a way to cover Hogan, but to try to make him look good. So they can't ignore the steroids. They can't ignore the Hart decision. They can't ignore some of the later things, but we're going to at least briefly touch upon it. Like I said, They did not touch about the amount of drugs he was probably doing, and I stand by that. The amount of drinking he was probably drunk. Yeah, they were having fun before the family was. The kids were around because they were probably constantly partying. Those little clips of him on the boat and stuff like that. You think he was sober? Like, I mean, come on.
He did have a lot of back and knee issues, so I know probably he was getting a shit ton of painkillers. And
but they did talk about it, but most of that didn't happen until much farther down the road. I don't think he had his first surgery until he was in his 40s or something like that. So it's not like he was if he was in pain, he didn't talk about it even then. He's like, I never had any issues. And then he got like, I thought I heard 50. I could be making it up. But he got a crap ton of injuries later on as far as that goes. I put it down here somewhere. I don't know. We'll come apart. But yeah, knee surgery. His first surgery was in 99. So he'd already been wrestling like 20 years. At least
he underwent at least 25 medical procedures.
Yeah, but they would have been, this is 99. He probably, like I said, it was at least probably in his 40s, and they started adding it up. Unfortunately, that happens in wrestling. It's a physical thing. But basically, circling back to where we were, so he did one of the screw jobs Bret Hart unfortunately faced. As far as that with Yokozuna and whatnot. If anything, the fact that Bret Hart was somehow managing to even do that fake arm wave, oh yeah, go get Yokozuna, that was probably hard for him to fucking do, knowing he was getting fucking screwed over. But like I said, Bret Hart lets you know it. Unfortunately, like I said, he's just really bitter about it. But what happened is once that kind of happened, and Hogan wasn't getting the same pop he was, the excitement for beating it. That's when the idea is, okay, Hogan, we think you're done as the character you are, and that's it. And Vince says Hogan is done with it getting pushed, and we're gonna get the belt back to Yokozuna. And I think at that point, it's like a forced retirement. Once again, Hogan doesn't want to leave. He's being pushed out. So at this point, that's when you and I enjoyed our most famous Suburban Commando as far as that goes. He was out of wrestling for at least a few minutes, to say the least.
Yes, Suburban Commando, Thunder in Paradise.
Mr. Nanny, which I don't remember that much. I did watch, but Thunder in Paradise and Suburban Commander. What's the wrestling one? He fights Zeus. No Holds Bar was in there.
Shout out Steve, No Holds Barred.
Yeah, buddy, No Holds Bar.
Got a little tanny wanger.
And he's just, he probably was setting money, setting popularity. He was good, but I bet you he was fucking miserable. I bet you he was miserable because then in about 94, he was recruited to WCW by Eric Bischoff. He's making an attempt to push past the steroids, and he was getting pushed to fight Ric Flair and to win the title. All right, but in the process, it seemed like it was fine. But then he started getting boos. Mind you, he's still running this all-American bit. The steroids is out there. It's all been admitted. He didn't throw Vince McMahon under the bus, even though that a lot of people were saying Vince McMahon was basically supplying everybody with steroids. He didn't do that. I think once again, produced in a manner that shows, okay, he did a bad thing, but he wasn't the bad guy. I think once again, which I relatively agree, but I also think it's his way of making sure it gets out there that it wasn't over on his decision. It was on somebody else who doesn't get enough of the blame for making all this happen, and which I personally believe he also used himself, because he went from scrawny to really big too later on in his career, but we won't go into that too much.
I'll say that's a pretty accurate depiction.
So in the process of trying to do this, and the boos start happening, we get into an early stages of probably my favorite Hogan era, right? In 96, The Outsiders, Scott Hall and Kevin Nash. Rest in peace, Scott Hall. This is probably my favorite tag team ever. They were awesome. They were bad boys, but they actually could wrestle. Their moves were cool and everything. Their characters are cool. And they do Bash at the Beach. And Hogan turns fucking heel.
So yeah, the title of the third part was called Hollywood Hogan. And as Kevin said, they went to WCW, and that's where Hulk was seeing the outsiders getting kind of over, and he said, okay, so you guys are ready for some edgy gangster stuff.
Well, it's crazy because I don't think Hall and Nash knew he was turning heel. I don't think Bischoff...
They talked about it. So Bischoff and Hogan were like, I think the only ones who might have known. Hall and Nash didn't know that was going to happen.
But no, I don't even know how much Bischoff knew it was or when it was. This feels like Bischoff, a spur of the moment, though.
No, Bischoff had to know.
You think so?
Oh, Bischoff definitely had to know what was going on. And, Hulk flipped the script to give them something they would never forget as long as they live. And he was damn right, because they were saying he betrayed WCW, he sold his soul to the devil. I mean, there was a moment of silence. And yeah, this right here is the future of wrestling, and that's when he was like, this is the new world order of wrestling.
I fucking love it. Once again, this is my favorite Hogan, but he was never really my favorite wrestler. I like Macho Man better than him, but I always loved him as a wrestler. But when he became Hollywood Hogan, and he was what he was with the Outsiders and NWO... Dude, it was hard to beat.
And the music, too, was iconic.
Once again, playing the bass. I always said guitar, but actually, it's really Jimi Hendrix playing the guitar. But you know what I mean? I was like, oh my God, this resonated so high.
New world order.
It was so good. They were an era of bad boys when I think people were over, not just in wrestling, but in society, over hey, you don't have to be a good old boy all the time. It's not normal. I think they were trying to personify, if you think about it, American society in a sense, as you wanted somebody with a little bit of edge. And I think this is where, once again, the separation from the person, Terry Bollea versus Terry Hulk Hogan, is, I don't think there was one. I think his malicious energy and feelings that he was getting crapped on, that he didn't deserve, but in reality he probably did, but he felt like he didn't deserve that because he's been so good to the fans. I think it came out, and that's why I think he even mentioned about being one of the freest he's ever been, is because I think he was living his real feelings. And to be fair, it's hard to untangle those two, Terry Bollea and Terry Hulk Hogan. So that's why I think, it's kind of like actors when they do acting, and they do, I can't remember the type of acting style, but it's like the realism acting. They live their character on and off. Some people don't like it.
Method acting?
Yes, maybe? Method acting. Thank you. They don't like it. Other people that are around them, because, recently the one Joker guy, people didn't like too much, Jared Leto, when he was giving, was it Will Smith a fucking dead rat in a box or shit?
Yeah, I hope at least he comes out in the Masters of Universe movie. So we'll see.
So when you're doing an element of that, sometimes people don't like that. But in reality, Hogan, I don't think was like that all the time, but his at least feelings when he was Hollywood Hogan were coming out towards people with the way he felt disrespected and being poorly treated. He had no problem kind of being like, yeah, well, you guys want to say fuck you to me, fuck you right back. I think it was really coming out of him in a form for sure.
Dude, everyone on the fucking planet wanted to be part of the NWO. I remember us getting NWO t-shirts, and
I have
you had
two
both of them.
I have the red and the white. We won't try to go down the NWO but that rabbit hole, but this led to, that was in 96, this led to 97. The WCW had beat the WWF 83 weeks in a row with ratings. Now, this isn't part of this, but I watched, there's a little documentary of the rise and fall of WCW, with Eric Bischoff and everything else on, this was, I think, on Hulu or whatever like that. And it covered a lot of this. And to say that Vince McMahon wasn't scrambling when this was happening would be a lie. He was probably pulling his hair out, and the fact that Hulk was probably just shining the light, because it's almost like when Tom Brady left the Patriots to have the success in Tampa Bay and New England's going down under, is like, it was a way of saying it's not you, it's me. Now, the truth and the reality is it was both of them, all right? It's always going to be both, no matter who wants to say it. It doesn't mean somebody can't have... It's not like Tom Brady went to the fucking Raiders and made the Raiders win. He went to Tampa Bay, who had a great defense. They had great pieces in place. Tom Brady's the best quarterback, in my opinion. Even if it's the most successful one, he still is. Hulk Hogan is one of the greatest talents wrestling's ever had and is ever going to have. He didn't need much, but he got it. He went to something that was there. It was just chaotic and unorganized. Now, it led to the fall because that chaos and disorganization eventually was going unchecked, which was what Vince McMahon had. Hogan was always his number one product, his baby. But that doesn't mean Hogan didn't overstep bounds. And he even alluded to that in interviews. So you need that. But I think when he kind of just left Hogan as on the scrap heap, he made it seem like he didn't need him at all. You could have still used it, but at the same time, Hogan's ego might not have let that happen as if he was put in the back burners either. It would have maybe been just as bad.
Yeah, I mean, he still had notoriety in the sport, right? So that's why he lifted up WCW like it did, even towards the actual end, of WCW.
I mean, so this is when his family started having issues. I think, once again, his bad feelings, character started coming out, played a role into that. That's when, in 1999, he had his first surgery. He had a run for president. I remember this. I thought it was a joke. Apparently, it was dead fucking serious. I thought it was great. I'm like, oh man, that's great part of the actor or the characters say you're going to run for president because you're that awesome. No, apparently that was legit, and he was literally legit about that. I'm like, that was bad. That's actually bad. But the idea of just saying you're running for it would have been fine. I remember this might have been when everybody was saying they were going to run for president. Do you remember that? Like, I think I pitied a fool. Was it Mr. T? No, that's not. No, there was a little person from a show that said Willis. We show about Willis. He was going to run for president. There was a porn star that was going to run for president. There was like 3 or 4 celebrities that were just going to run for president.
Were you going to run for president?
No, of course not. I wasn't old enough. So there was so many people that were going to run for president. I remember hearing Hulk Hogan. I'm like, oh, this is just a joke. And I thought it all was, but apparently he's like, oh, I thought it would seriously win. I don't know that he was seriously won, but I think that just him saying that line just showed the ego that really I think they made attempts to hide his ego in this and make him more humble than what he really was. I don't think he was a humble person. That doesn't mean he was a bad person. I just don't think he had a whole lot of humility from what I feel like. I think age gave him some more than what he'd like to have. I just don't feel like he was a humble person. I think that portrayal was an attempt, but I don't think it was. To me, it didn't resonate because I just didn't think that. I don't know if you feel like he's a humble person or not.
Nah, he definitely had an ego for sure. Otherwise, he wouldn't have got into it with Vince like he did over a lot of the stuff over the years. So
yeah, so then it's like, okay, if it's going so great, what happens? Well, the finger poke of doom versus Kevin Nash is really, I think, not just his downfall. And this is really getting to the end of the roller coaster, but it ended up, I think, putting Bischoff and Hogan in very bad light. And it ended up WWF ratings go back up. Vince Russo comes in and ruins WCW, and I stand by that. He did, and he gets kicked out of WCW. And then with a whirlwind of twist, and if this is where sometimes he who laughs last. What's the expression? I don't know. Something about laughing last. That's the expression. That's when WCW is bought by the WWF. So
with Shane McMahon showing up on fucking Nitro.
Yes.
Wild.
Hogan having medical issues. At this point, he definitely thought he was going to retire as far as that goes. But that's not what happened. He ends up returning to the WWF in 02 to face The Rock. You know, he comes in off of Hollywood Hogan, not thinking that he was supposed to be a face. But once again, and a couple of other times, fans start cheering him like crazy. He lost the match, but he got the fan appreciation. They turned him face. They were cheering for him. It's just now, if you consider his personality, his persona, this all-American boy turned bad boy, kind of comes back to being good, even though he's got some dirt on his hands, so to say. It's like he's been able to expunge his demons, sort of, as far as that goes. That's kind of where this the third part kind of closes out, and we start getting the last part.
Yeah, I just wanted to say the old Lion versus the new Lion,
that was
Hollywood
a good way
Hogan versus The Rock, and it was crazy because the as you said, Kev, the script flipped because he went into the match being essentially the bad guy or the heel, and The Rock was the good guy. And during the actual match, everyone was basically cheering for Hogan, so they kind of flipped sides, and it was like a double turn where now The Rock's the freaking bad guy, and Hogan's getting cheered. And even though he didn't win the match, he won the people over, essentially, and it was an iconic match of all time, for sure.
It definitely was. I think it was his biggest last hurrah in wrestling, from what I gather and what I remember. And he still didn't want to be done, because once again, sometimes the sports and the fans tell you you're done. He didn't want to be done. Like I said, he never wanted to be done. I think he should have just saw it as kind of like Ric Flair did. You need to transition to a different role. You have to accept it. If you were the superstar, at some point, you're not the same superstar. And that's just what it is. It's not a bad thing. It's normal life, right? You can't be the center stage. And I think some people, even like Triple H, Triple H is one of my favorite wrestlers. And I think he made a great way to transition to like being relevant by being a figurehead versus trying to wrestle all the time. Because, I mean, what is wrestling now? It was a lot of soap opera drama, and it helped pave, angles and whatnot. So if he would have done that, I think he could have been more relevant longer and had a bigger role. But I don't think he thought that way. I think it was like he thought he had to wrestle. You know what I mean? Maybe he didn't want to accept the transition. I don't know. Do you feel differently?
Yeah, and the last part of the miniseries was called Hulk vs. Terry, and that's kind of diving down the rest of the roller coaster on that last hurrah. And do you even remember, Kevin, he was part of TNA? They did have the Hogan Knows Best reality series.
Yeah.
And then eventually, he gets divorced and goes through that. He had a lot going on as far as in this part, back surgery, medical drugs, sex tape, free speech, like all types of stuff in the last freaking episode. So it felt like a roller coaster.
Yeah, I think this is the part where you start getting the outside of wrestling life. He goes through the transition with Vince and then Michaels, and then finally his last match versus Orton. And there were signs even versus Vince and Shawn Michaels that his wrestling ability has dropped dramatically. And yet he still feels he deserves notoriety, which I think led to the Hogan Knows Best, which I do remember watching. Me
too.
And the first season was fun. They mentioned about how the family was strained and having issues, and that sort of was bringing them together. But once again, the longer and longer you get under a lens, which is what they were doing, the more and more the cracks started not only showing but even widening, which eventually leads to him cheating and his family falling apart in that regards. But it didn't even go well. Like, he was dating a younger girl. I remember his ex Linda ends up dating a younger dude. I do believe it was one of Nick's friends, which is his son, which I do vaguely remember that being an issue and whatnot. And then he even talks about about getting suicidal. I think a lot of this happens is because he's out of wrestling. Like, he didn't know what to do with himself, and that's why even doing the show was a way to keep himself entertained. But somehow, some way, he finds himself back into wrestling in a form in '09 in TNA. I mean, at this point, the amount of surgeries have piled up. You know, the sex tape, as you alluded to, came out. And then even more down the road, the racial slurs. If he's not been free falling and just rolling around in mud at this point in his life, I think he just didn't know what to do with himself, and the only thing he knew was wrestling, and he lost that, which I think happens to some people in retirement, so to say. And it's like, okay, you could still love wrestling. How do you get back into it? There were plenty of people that weren't wrestling that were still doing stuff. I think if he would have done that, it would have been fine.
And you can look at even sports now, you know, when as far as a correlation, because it's the same thing. You're only going to be at your peak in the pro sports. I don't even know what the average is, but say
depends on the sport.
5 to 10 years. And then after the limelight, it's like, that's why I think it's so prominent to figure out what you're trying to do, because after that, it's like, okay, that's why you see people going into broadcasting, which I think even Hogan probably would have done well with that.
Absolutely.
So, but yeah, that's a huge thing as far as the retirement life, or after what your main career was, what are you going to do with the rest of your life?
So at this point in time, after all this chaos is going down, he seems to be kind of flailing and not being able to keep himself floated above. They talk about him meeting his third wife. I will circle back to that a little bit, Element, but he meets his third wife, and Sky Daly, and she helps him kind of find faith again. And I do think a lot of older generations, or at least once you become of a certain age, you know, the end is going to happen to all of us. That's the thing. And I think people want to try to make sense of the here, the now, the previous, and then the future, whatever that may be. And I think faith is a way to attempt to do that, no matter what it is. And I think faith is a good thing, and I think it gets a dirty light no matter what religion it is. I think it is meant to try to help, you know, people, and we don't look at it like that. And I think that's a disappointing thing. But he kind of wanted to shine light on how faith helped him get back into that, brought based upon by his wife, but still, this was a huge ordeal to him, and I think it helped him get, you know, kind of, you know, if you're free falling and you're just spinning all over the place, you just kind of get leveled out.
Like, and grounded again.
Yeah, I think this helped him do that, which then it went from kind of being a black eye not only on himself personally and professionally. It allowed him to be able to at least get back to being able to represent himself in a healthier manner, right? Not suicidal and all that. And then he starts getting more slowly back recognition in the wrestling. You know, NWO Hall of Fame in 2021. Jimmy Hart's been with him the whole time. I love that element. That's not easy to do.
Ride or die, Jimmy Hart.
And so then it kind of gets to the last leg of it. And the last leg of it is the 2024 Republican Convention. All right, he kind of came out. He had his own beer product and stuff like that, and he goes and he supports Trump. And this isn't supposed to be about politics. I'm not going to make it about it. But he wanted to give his support for somebody he knows. And a friend that goes back, as we stated, you know, business-wise, probably they probably hung out multiple times. And what happened is, because of this, when they went to L.A., you know, California, a very blue Democratic state, he got booed immediately.
I don't know if you saw it, Kevin, but yeah, for American beer, he got booed in L.A.
Big time.
Big time.
And the one thing that is unfortunate is it was his last wrestling appearance, like last related wrestling appearance. I don't think he was that bothered by it. I really don't. The way he was acting, when I saw his face, he didn't seem bothered by it. I think the fact that they reacted is what made him like he fed off of that. Whether it's going to be good or bad, he got the reaction. So I think he did fine with that. It stinks a little bit as a fan of wrestling, not necessarily a fan of Hogan, that you would boo somebody and that light wasn't exactly seen as that, because the outside social society aspect got into it. But once again, you can't separate that. Fans are going to make decisions off the so that's fine. But that happened, and then which eventually, that I think a couple months later, on July 24th, 2025. He went to go in for a surgery, and unfortunately, he never came out of it. And so there was a big tie-in, a big ordeal. I remember being like, whoa, that was crazy. They did a 10-bell salute for him. They did treat it that way. Seeing Jimmy Hart break down was, as a fan of, appreciation, but just the human watching somebody have a bond like that for, decades. I could feel it. Like it resonated with me. I felt it. And I think that was an element they wanted with this. I think, if you were a wrestling fan, a Hogan fan at all, no matter what he did outside of the ring, it was a sad day. I think the wrestling world lost the greatest figure that we'll ever see for the sport. I don't know that anybody else will influence it to his degree ever again. And so, yeah, it does suck, I think, to have that happen, because Ric Flair has been, maybe not the most relevant like he was in WCW, but he's still kicking around. His daughter's in there. He's still an influence, and that's great for wrestling. I just think if Hogan was able to do that, it would have been next level.
Yeah, where's Brooke Hogan's musical career? No, but Jimmy Hart was definitely his ride or die. I can't remember if they said during the documentary or not that he was like one of the only people that didn't borrow money from Hogan or something like that. And maybe that's why they've been longtime friends. I'm not really sure, but one of the things I did write down, which I thought Eric Bischoff said very beautifully, he said, people remember on how they made you feel, how Hulk Hogan made them feel. Hulk Hogan made millions of people around the world feel patriotic, feel a rush of adrenaline, feel exciting, feel elated for this guy that they thought was their all-time hero. But he made people feel. It's what Hulk Hogan did. And I loved how he kind of said that, because I agree 1,000% as far as everything he said about it.
I am with you. Like I said, maybe you didn't like him towards the end, but if you ever watched it or paid attention to him, I would be surprised if you didn't like him at one point. And just to understand the impact he caused, like he was like massive. He was the sport at one time, you know what I mean? And what he was able to do. And it is just disappointing. There's so many things and so many elements that you could continue to dissect of what he, shouldn't have done or should have done. And things outside of wrestling. Even, unfortunately, the manipulative decisions he made inside of wrestling to get what he wanted. I thought he's great, but he's an egomaniac. He always was. He wanted to be king at all times, no matter what it was, and you saw it. They tried not to make that evident here. I don't care what they say. There's no way you get to that level and don't think and act for yourself at all times. As long as somebody's not affecting him, he probably wouldn't care about the decision as much. But if that was going to be tied to him, he wanted to have full control, and it was showed. He had Vince's ear when he went to WCW. Eric Bischoff may have been the person running it, but in reality, if Hogan wanted something done, it was done. And that's shown for his career. When he lost that control, I think he lost his control of his own actual life, and it was just gone. And that's really what this kind of his life kind of sums up. And it's That doesn't mean you're expected to be a perfect person. By all means, nobody is. But I'm happy I got to experience him. It made a lot as a younger, kid being able to experience wrestling and enjoy it to the level I did. He was a huge reason for it. But let's call a spade a spade. He was an egomaniac, period.
Yeah, he definitely had an ego. I don't think he would have gotten as far as he did without having some part of ego, and anyone in the wrestling business has to have a little bit of ego if you're going to survive, to be honest with you. But yeah, was he a perfect guy by any means? No, he definitely had and made plenty of mistakes with the racial slurs, the sex tapes, steroid scandals, you name it. He did a lot of good and bad. He didn't have a perfect, slate by any means, but again, he transcended the wrestling business. He brought it to another level, and he's going to be remembered for that for all of eternity. And that's pretty much all I got to say about it.
Two things I want to purposely throw in here. And like I said, I enjoyed this a lot as an overall thing. But two things to me stood out, and I want to make a very purposefully to point them out. As I said, this was produced with intent. It always is, no matter what. The first aspect is, at no point in this does Brooke Hogan show an appearance. I looked into why. Brooke Hogan was estranged from her father, Hulk Hogan. Meanwhile, Brian alluded earlier, his son Nick is talking throughout the whole miniseries and commenting on, and seems to have a very favorable relationship with Hogan. Even his first ex-wife is there. So there's a reason things were done in a fashion they weren't done. It's never mentioned at any point that Hogan's relationship with Brooke was in bad terms, had anything to do with anything. In fact, it was mentioned she didn't want to be on it to cause any more family drama. So my opinion is she would have probably said things that wouldn't have matched up with what they wanted to put on here. And that, once again, goes to show that he wasn't perfect. We know that, but I don't know if we would have gotten an element that would have kind of mess with the narrative too much. Next, and related to that, is I, watching the fourth installment, was very surprised when it says he got married for the third time. And I said, it went from Linda to who? And when? Where? What? So I wrote this, I researched this because I wanted to know, and this was important to that. So his first wife, Linda Claridge, was from 83 to 09. Then his second wife, never even mentioned by name, nothing, was Jennifer McDaniel. I didn't look into that, but she was from 2010 to 2021. An 11-year marriage and not one mention. This is all in the time period where he's dealing with these scandals, dealing with the slurs, all this stuff, not one mentioned. I'm sure she would have said so many nice things about him. And then 22 to his passing in 24 is when he married his third wife, Sky Daly. So once again, why was the second wife not even mentioned by name, not even brought up, saying second wife? Like, it was not even discussed. Once again, I would imagine she probably didn't want to be on it, which is fine, but why wouldn't somebody want to be on something that's trying to paint a bio sort of pic of you? It's probably because she has nothing she wants to say kindly. So I have to imagine that there are probably things that happened in that relationship that would have made his so-called like era of racial slurs and stuff, it probably would have made him look even worse. And I don't think he wanted to look even worse than he wanted to even own up to some of that, because once again, his ego goes into. But like I said, I do believe towards the end, when he met, as they said, his third wife, he probably cycled back to a sense of finding, and as Brian said, being grounded and finding faith. And I think that does that for a lot of people. But just these things are done intentionally. There is reasons why these aren't done. You don't know, and in a way, I don't know that I need to know because I'm just aware of that. I think the whole point is Hogan was a superstar for wrestling. He was and made wrestling what it is, but he was also a person. And if you consider that everything that can happen outside of that is in a sense, none of our business, then I think that's fine. It doesn't mean it doesn't affect, like the fans are aware of this, right? Things that happen in sports, wrestling is an entertainment sport. If things happen outside of that, if you don't think you're going to get booed while you're at the game, then I think you're going to be foolish. Things aren't kept in bubbles and isolated like they are anymore. In fact, it's worse now than ever. And so we're human. We're going to have some of that mistakes happen. I think he wanted to try to appear to understand that he made mistakes. He knows that. I just don't think he wanted it to come out of how bad they may have been so that he wouldn't be looked that poorly, so that he could still kind of come out on top, because he always in the end had the ego, wanted to be the guy, always wanted to be the face and wanted to cheers, even though he had boo period with Hollywood Hogan. I think he really wanted to be the face, and for all intents and purposes he will always be awesome in my book as far as a wrestler goes, and his personal life is really none of my business, but that's just me.
Yeah, and I just looked up real quick. She chose not to participate, and she may have wanted to avoid the spotlight and refrain from sharing her side of the past family story. But anyhow, yeah, and also from Reddit, there were some mentions of, his reluctance to join the NWO, the unnecessary digs at Shawn Michaels over SummerSlam, and then also into heavy MAGA undertones in the back half of episode 4, but that's all I want.
But is that different than what I said? It's your personal life, carrying over into the wrestling world, and even though in a lot of ways they should be separated, you understand why they're tied to things as far as that goes. And if we don't know that MAGA is a huge fucking splitting division these days, I don't know if you've been paying attention to anything. There is nobody that falls really in the middle ground of that. You're either one side or the other, unfortunately. And some people, if you're on one side or the other, you don't really nobody wants to hear the other side. But that's not for now. The point being is Hulk Hogan is always going to be probably the biggest legend in my wrestling book.
Yeah, just kind of wrapping up here. Terry Bollea was just a human being, but the legend of Hulk Hogan will live forever for sure. So, I don't know if we want to necessarily do a rating for this. I would definitely say it was solid. It was pretty damn good. Although, as you kind of alluded to, Kevin, they left out some pieces to it. But
there was intentional missing details, but I don't think anything that was there was necessarily inaccurate. You know what I mean? I think there were things that made things more complicated, like his brother's death, betrayal of him and his character, maybe sometimes the way he sees some things. I think that's probably accurate how he sees it, but I definitely know he screwed job on fucking Bret Hart. You know what I mean? Maybe he didn't see that the way it is, and I think that's what this was, in a way to show how he saw it. I think there's a lot of truth to what that is. It doesn't mean it's the whole truth, but I think it is relatively truthful. But it was an entertaining watch. I think you got to at least be interested in Hogan. If you're not interested in wrestling or him, you are not going to like this for sure.
100%. So, well, this definitely was a tad on the longer side, but thanks for sticking around, and I do hope you enjoyed this little bit of a different episode of our pod today.
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of a little bit of storytelling, but mixed in with our experiences, because like I said, this one hit a little close to home with what wrestling has done for us as a viewer, as a fan, and just being able to have done it and inform ourselves.
Yeah, so if you've enjoyed the podcast, go ahead and please support us on social media out there as well.
For sure. We got the Apple Podcast and Spotify on Tuesdays, and then YouTube on Thursdays.
All right. Peace out, you nerds.
Holla back.